Alright, this is going to be a little bit different video. Some of you know this, some of you don't. I'm actually a classically trained musician. That's what I went to college for. I'm a clarinet player by training, I guess you could say. It has nothing to do with my current job, but I was very much into music growing up. Played piano, although not very well. Became very good at the clarinet. I got a pretty good scholarship. I didn't get a full ride. I got a half ride to attend school. I had to be in the band that entire time, and that's what my degree is in. And as soon as I graduated, I went and got a job in oil. But um, music has always been a big part of my life, and I think it's an area that libertarians tend never to really think about, and that's fine because um, there really are other issues that are more pressing. But it is an area that, if you look at it, one can definitely see the influence of market incentives uh, on the creative process. And basically, uh, when you have a system, when you have musicians who have to earn a living, the quality of their output is qualitatively greater than musicians and composers whose living is not dependent on market forces. And this is something I came really to realize in college, something I never probably would have thought about otherwise. I'd always loved music. I always loved listening to mostly people would say that I like classical music. Obviously, there are other categorizations of that. Baroque, romantic, whatever. The classical is actually a pretty narrow thing. And I've always really enjoyed music. But when I was in college, we played a lot of stuff in the band, and it was god awful and terrible. I mean, just like fingernails on a chalkboard kind of stuff. And the composers who wrote that stuff did not depend on their income on the compositions that they wrote. And we knew some in particular. There was a composer at my school. There were several composers. There's a composer faculty. And they're basically given a pretty decent salary. I don't know if it's six figures. Probably once you add in benefits, probably is. And it's not based on how good the compositions are, as if there was any way to qualitatively judge that, how many scores they sell, anything like that. It's just they're basically a bureaucrat. They have to do classes that teach composition, but the quality of the stuff they produce is completely irrelevant, and the stuff that they produce is terrible. And I actually went and looked through my CD collection. I have one guy and one composer in particular that I'm thinking about, and I actually went through and we had to. He was at our school, and whenever he came out with a new piece, we'd have to perform or premiere it, which is pretty much the only time these pieces will get played. They'll get premiered, and then they'll never get played again, except perhaps by other schools that are, have nothing better to do than to systematically go through and play everything that's contemporary. So I went through and looked in my collection, and I actually don't have any recordings of his because they're so awful that I made a point not to purchase them. At our school, you could go and say, "Hey, I want this concert," and I looked, and his stuff is conspicuously absent. I went on YouTube, and YouTube has everything, right? I typed his name, I found 2 or 3 choral pieces, none of his band pieces, and again, I can understand this; they're so terrible. But it's interesting because you go to just regular people and out of the blue, and you ask them about this, and they say, "Well, music and art that shouldn't be based on money." Well, Beethoven and Mozart and Bach were all doing that for money. Uh, it was a slightly different kind of arrangement that we think of today. They were often, if you look at someone like Bach, he was basically getting a job with the church and basically running all the musical activities of the church and then composing on the side. You look at someone like Mozart, he was giving piano lessons. And then he'd do commissions. He'd get paid to write operas or the libretti to an opera, or sometimes to perform when he was younger. Um, and that's not what most people think of, but it's for money. He's doing it for money. Now, the contemporary compositions that I enjoy the most are movie soundtracks. Now, movie soundtracks are definitely for pay. You can't just go and be like, "Oh, this is the artistic-y thing that I like to do," and compose whatever you want, you have to do something that's going to make the producers happy, and what's going to make them happy is what's going to serve the interest of the movie. It's going to sound good on celluloid or on film, and that's a constraint. And you could say, oh, it's hurting their artistic flowering. Well, people can write whatever they want at home, but that doesn't mean the rest of us should be forced to subsidize it. So to kind of parlay this, I've come up with some of my favorite movie soundtracks. I qualify this list. So this is slightly tangential to my introduction here. That's just kind of my excuse for making this a relevant video. Everyone's perspectives on things like movies is really based on their own experience. And so there's no way that I'm going to pick soundtracks to movies that I've never seen or heard of. It's kind of like the API list of 100 best movies. You know, there are hardly any silent movies on there, hardly any black and white movies. You know, it's definitely a list that reflects the person who's compiling the list more than some kind of objective analysis of everything. So, you know, there are a few soundtracks that I like that are 50, 60, 70 years old, but only a few. How I pick a soundtrack I like is if I see the movie, if I like the soundtrack, I'll check it out. And at this point in my life, I'm pretty amenable to just buying it. There's a couple that I've downloaded on Amazon now recently, and it turns out that there are a couple composers that I like because I've ended up with several of their works. So I'm not saying that these are the best soundtracks ever. I'm not going to rank these. These aren't in a particular order, though. I'm going to start out with ones that I think are flawed but still worthwhile. And these are mostly pretty well-known films. One of the older ones, and this is because the movie is a famous movie, and so even though it's old, lots of people are like to have seen it, is this one, Ben-Hur. Problem with this soundtrack is this is big and annoying. As you can see, it's empty because mine is in my car. This is by a famous composer named Miklos Rozsa. He's Hungarian, and he did a lot of these big budget Charlton Heston films in the 50s and 60s. I like this soundtrack. It has a lot of really beautiful tracks in it and some very memorable tracks in it, but it also has a lot of stuff that's relatively boring. And the format, the idea of what a movie soundtrack had was different then than it is now. I mean, there's more than one right way to do it, but kind of my ultimate soundtrack is one that stands on its own feet, but also lets you relive the movie. So there are some of them that I can listen to, and it's like watching the movie. I can be in my car, and it's like I'm watching the movie, but I'm just listening to it. You can't really do that with this one so much. There's parts that are like, oh, it's this part, that part, but you know, it's not as good. Another one, similar vein, a little bit younger, Lawrence of Arabia. The theme of this is very famous and deservedly so. Again, this is a little bit different. It's basically like a suite, like it's not real thematic. It's not real music that's going right along with the moment. You know, like a lot of times in action scenes, you have music that correlates exactly with what the action's going. You know, someone goes like this, and the music has a cue right at that point. Lawrence of Arabia is not like that at all. It's like he wrote music that sounds Arab inspired. It sounds great when they show show them two guys on a camel over the dunes. But you know, this is also a very short soundtrack. It's got 14 tracks, and most of them are like 2 minutes long. There's a few that are a little bit longer. So this is one that really makes you want more. But it is cool. It's nice to be driving down the road. I do most of my listening in my car these days, but driving down and have the caravan music going, it's nice. The theme of this is famous, although I'm going to say the soundtrack as a whole is not that great. It is the Superman soundtrack. Everyone, of course, knows the Superman theme, and that's something that the composer of this is, I'd say, pretty much hands down the most famous music composer, movie music composer, and that's John Williams. He has a huge number of themes. Both George Lucas and Steven Spielberg basically like to go to this guy for almost all their films. So one wonders if his compositions are well known because he's a great composer, or if because he gets all the really big names. Um, there's also a lot of controversy about him in the music community because he's kind of considered a plagiarist. Some of his most famous pieces sound very, very similar to other pieces, not by him, but by others. For instance, the Imperial March from Star Wars, that dun 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 dun. Pardon my singing, I was a clarinet player, not a vocalist. Sounds very similar to the movement Mars from the Planets by Holst. But, you know, I don't really believe in intellectual property, and I'm not one to really be critical of somebody for doing this. I guess I can say if it sounds really, really original, then I can give you props for that, but I really mostly care about how it sounds. Now, so this one has some very excellent tracks in it, but by and large, it's not a great soundtrack altogether. And also, it's kind of hard to find. Some of these soundtracks have been redone over and over and over again, and you basically can select which one you think is the best. And with this, there weren't that many, and it was expensive. So, not recommending you necessarily buy it, but and the other thing is the theme is so famous that the theme by itself has been redone probably tens of thousands of times. So if you go and you type Superman theme, even reading out all the shows and movies that it's been in since then, it'd be hard. It's actually slightly difficult to find the actual soundtrack, but whatever. This one is again not the greatest, but it has certain elements that I really like. This is Shawshank Redemption. This is one I just got this year. The one thing I like about this, and I've noticed this composer did a few other soundtracks, and I haven't even looked, but I'm sure he did the soundtrack, and it's by the way, Thomas Newman. I'm sure he did Cinderella Man because it sounds the exact same. And the interesting thing is those are movies that take place in the mid-century, the 30s, 40s, 50s. And there's something about his music that fits that very well. I don't know what exactly it is. It's use of the kind of the fiddle, maybe, I don't know. And a lot of this sounds like contemporary to that, but some of it has a very, how do I say this, kind of an ethereal, supernatural kind of, almost like the theme from, what's that movie? Field of Dreams. It has this kind of otherworldly sense to it too. It's not a great soundtrack. It's not one that you hum, but there are certain tracks that I found were pretty cool. Let's save those for later. This is a good one. This is by Trevor Jones and Randy Edelman. The Last of the Mohicans. This is actually a redo. This is a re-recording. The original has a picture of Daniel Day-Lewis, a very intense picture of him running. This is a really good soundtrack. It's I don't know. It's just a very, very good soundtrack, and I wish the end credit music is just beautiful, and it's not in the soundtrack. However, I was able to find it on YouTube, so that's good. One thing though about this, I think it was synthesized, which I think you can tell, but whatever. A pretty famous movie composer is Hans Zimmer. I don't particularly like most of his soundtracks. He's got a few that are okay. He's got a couple tracks that are amazing. First track to the Gladiator soundtrack, by the way, is amazing. But his most famous movies that have come out recently have been the Batman trilogy. And here are two of them. This is the latest one, The Dark Knight Rises and The Dark Knight. And Batman Begins I do not have on a CD, but I have downloaded it. I like them all. They're minimalist, and I like minimalism. And thematic material, the idea being if you were going to tell a story in music, if I were going to tell a story about, say, your entire life, like a biography, and I wrote it out in music, and I did so so that it would only take 30 seconds, that wouldn't be very evocative. It wouldn't be able to tell you very much about that person's life, and just because of the length. And the longer you make something, the slower the development, the closer it is to the actual time scale it's trying to um, describe, and so the more realistic it is. And so something like Batman and the Christopher Nolan version of Batman, which is something I really like about that, especially in Batman Begins, he gradually develops into Batman over the course of 2 hours. And of course, the movie is taking place over several years. The soundtrack, likewise, is minimalist, and so you don't have a lot of melody that's changing all over the place. You have a very gradual, you just have a basic theme that's slowly built upon until you do have something that's rather different. And in that sense, it's a really compelling and interesting soundtrack, all three of them. One composer that I've ended up with a lot of music from is Jerry Goldsmith. He died recently. He was prolific. He was also well known for being very, very accommodating to the desires of the filmmaker. So he was not someone who would say, well, this is the way I want to write it, so this is the way it's going to go, unlike some of the other composers that I'm going to mention later. And I mean, because there have been times where directors have said, he would write something he'd think it would be great, and the director would be like, no, this is terrible, and he would just start from scratch and redo it. He has quite a few that are good, but the one I want to mention first and foremost is a movie that was kind of a flop, but has a great soundtrack, The 13th Warrior, with Antonio Banderas. The weird plot, I think based on a Michael or Stephen King book, but I'm not positive. I think the book was called Eaters of the Dead. It's actually an interesting movie, but this is a great soundtrack. He has a lot of Arab influenced stuff in here, and it's really quite a pleasure to listen to. I watched the movie, and there are parts in the movie where it just really comes out, but then when you get the soundtrack, it's even better. This is one of my favorite soundtracks ever, The 13th Warrior. So this is one I liked it. It doesn't mean you will, but whatever. Oh, I'm missing. Oh, Jesus Christ! I have a whole other stack right there. Just a second. Just looking at the ones I had laid out. I was like, I'm missing some. I found them. Just real quickly here. Oh, okay, so when I was in college, I had a flip-through book of CDs, and that was lost, stolen, and for a long time I couldn't do anything about it because I was poor. But I slowly have regot, so I actually have doubles, and this to give you some idea how much I like this. I have two of these. I mentioned this one before, Gladiator. Hans Zimmer does a lot of really bellicose stuff. Bum, 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 bum. I used to go for that when I was a kid. I don't really go for it so much now, but the first track of this is maybe the best first track opening score I have ever heard. So if you're interested and you don't want to get the whole soundtrack, the name of that track is called Progeny, Progeny. So if you just type Gladiator soundtrack 1 Progeny, you can probably hear it online. Maybe it's not for you, but I loved it. Here's that. This is the actual Last of the Mohicans cover. There we go. So here's another composer that I have a lot of music from. He probably has maybe my favorite soundtrack ever, but this is not it. This is one of his other movies. James Horner. This is Glory. A decent Civil War film from the late 80s. Starring Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman. They basically got all the front A-list black actors to be in this one. They have a Harlem Boys Choir. This is a very good soundtrack. Not his best, though, not by a long shot. But this is a movie that has was not super famous at the time, but has slowly kind of developed a following. It's a genre film. It's a couple different genres, none of which are common anymore. The genres are British imperialism, war films, and the film is Zulu. It was the first movie, by the way, that Michael Caine was ever in, and uh, soundtrack was composed by John Barry, who he did a lot of the James Bond films, and I quite honestly don't care for any of them. But the soundtrack to Zulu, here we have right here, is excellent. Uh, the music that's there anyway, which I'm sorry to say there isn't very much. There are only 9 tracks, and most of them are under 2 minutes. There's one that's 5. Um, if you haven't seen this movie, it's a really good movie, and it's kind of survived this test of time. And also, on another interesting note, the copyright for the movie, I don't know about the soundtrack, but the movie was lost. Nobody owns the copyright to it, or at least for a time they didn't. And so, people are always saying if we didn't have copyright, people won't make things. No, since there's no copyright, if you try and buy Zulu on DVD, you have a plethora of options. There are at least 4 DVD versions of it, at least. And it's on Blu-ray also. I have it on DVD and Blu-ray and VHS tape. And when I've looked for it on VHS tape, I can't even find the version that I have. There's so many. The version I have, I can't even find, but there are other ones. So the idea that copyright, restricts is just ridiculous. I had a hard time picking a DVD because there were 4 of them, and I was like, well, which one's the best? And I had to go through and somebody had come up with a website where they compared the picture quality and everything. And eventually I made a very informed decision and got the best one. And then years later, I just bought the Blu-ray anyway. But soundtrack is pretty good. And he did another movie that's much better known that I will reference here shortly. This is another Hans Zimmer movie, The Mummy. You can hear that this sounds similar to the 13th Warrior, and of course they're from not far apart in time. But this is a classic big picture silver to screen orchestration, and that's what I'll say about Hans Zimmer's. I'm not Hans Zimmer. Jerry Goldsmith is he's really good at orchestration, and he has the voices of the orchestra down really well, and it makes even when he writes simple stuff, it comes off really well. This is from a largely forgotten composer at this point, Basil Paul Duris. This is the Conan the Barbarian soundtrack. If you ever watch Alex Jones, he uses a track from this as the transition music to and from commercial breaks quite often. That's the main track, actually, I think. This is actually very, very good. I'm not a big fan of the movie, but just listening to it, I thought, oh, there's some really cool stuff in here. And indeed there is. And Paul Duris wrote a couple other soundtracks in the 80s. I know he did Taps and, or maybe not Taps, Red Dawn, the original one. But this is really good. And he doesn't really sound like the other movie composers. So this is a good soundtrack. This newer composer, Harry Gregson Williams. Another one of his that I don't have here because I have it only on my computer. He did King Kong, and he also did the first Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is actually a great soundtrack, but I don't have a CD for it. This one is Kingdom of Heaven. This is a great soundtrack. It's also a great movie. Ridley Scott does pretty much the best historical films. There are other people who have done good ones, but he's done like 3 or 4 that have been just excellent. The most famous is Gladiator, and I think that's actually the worst. 1492, Conquest of Paradise, Kingdom of Heaven, and not Robin Hood, but some other ones are even better. But this is a great soundtrack. Lots of very interesting vocals. The first track, it's titled Burning the Past. It really takes you back. He uses the same. This takes place in the late 12th century, And that's a time when we were just transitioning from monophony to polyphony. Monophony means you have one note. Basically, everyone will be singing the same. Polyphony means you have multiple voices. And from what we can tell, this is about the period when we're kind of transitioning to polyphony. And it's so nice when you have a movie that's taking place back then to have music that on its own takes you there as well. And it's done extremely well. And I remember I had one of my music professors listen to this, and he was like, "Oh wow, what is that? That is something," and it is. To switch gears to a non-historical film, and this is a film that I didn't really like, and it's a totally different type of soundtrack, but it's, I would say, the best soundtrack in the last 10 years, with one exception, and that is this guy right here, Tron Legacy. This is actually by a music group called Daft Punk. They make a lot of electronic music, and I think they've been pretty successful doing that. I don't know if they did the original Tron or not, but this has electronic, but also has orchestration. I think they probably worked with somebody to do that, and it is amazing. This is an amazing soundtrack. I love this soundtrack. Like, listen to it every day for weeks at a time in the car going to and from work. I really can't say enough, and it's totally unlike any of the other ones. I'm sure you can find it online. Tron Legacy. Again, the movie dabbled with some interesting topics, but this is a case where the soundtrack is much better than the movie, which is usually not the case. I'm not saying the movie sucked, but like the soundtrack is top of the line. Here's another one. This is also by Randy Edelman, and I think he's most famous for writing the Simpsons soundtrack. But this is the soundtrack to Gettysburg. One thing that annoys me about this soundtrack is I'm pretty sure it was synthesized and it wasn't a live orchestra, and that makes a difference. But this is I don't know if it's just because I really like the movie or what, but this is a really good soundtrack. At the beginning of the movie, they show a whole bunch of black and white photos of the crew, who are, so it looks like you're looking at Civil War pictures, and the music that goes with that is just really captures the gravitas of that era, of that time. And I'm not saying that to glorify the Battle of Gettysburg, which is not really what the movie does either, but if you ever want to see a movie that takes an even-handed approach to the motivations of the two sides, Gettysburg is that movie. It is a unique and totally unusual movie in so many ways. The soundtrack is not that revolutionary, but it's excellent too. So Gettysburg. And probably, since we're going to be in that time period, this is John Barry's most famous soundtrack, I'm sure, which I believe he won best soundtrack with, and that is, of course, the soundtrack to Dances with Wolves. This is a great soundtrack. I think it really captures the idea of a frontier spirit, especially the stuff that plays when the main character is going out west for the first time. This is pretty recognizable. I think most people would, when they hear it, would go, "Oh yeah, Dances with Wolves." It's a great movie. It's not as politically correct as I think it tried to be. I mean, he was trying to portray the Indians as, Ubermensch, basically. The movie really doesn't do that, because the Indians are aggressive. They murder people, especially the Pawnee Indians. But it is a good soundtrack. I think John Barry is kind of, I don't know, I feel like I don't like him very much. I mean, he's dead now, but a lot of his other stuff he's written I just don't like. But this is a great soundtrack, and but it's also kind of expensive because he won an Oscar for it, and so he probably charges more. I don't know. All right, another James Horner soundtrack. This is a more recent one. Is Avatar. This is one that I actually initially got off YouTube, and I listened to it, and I liked it enough that I purchased it. And it has some excellent stuff in it. The opening track especially is quite good. But some of the other bellico stuff is pretty well done as well. I like his use of meter. He uses a lot of 5/8, which is a really good meter for like military stuff. And it's kind of a daunting task to be trying to depict an alien world, but he does it pretty well. And you know, that movie made a ton of money, and so I don't want to give it that much regard, but you know, props where props are due. It was a good soundtrack, and you know, I listen to it quite regularly in my car. Okay, 3 more for those of you who are getting impatient. How do I want to do this? All right, this soundtrack is actually could be considered 6 soundtracks. I'm only going to pick one, and that is this guy, Star Wars. Now, for Star Wars, you've got the original trilogy, and then you've got the prequel trilogies. The prequel trilogies are not as good as, and I'm talking about the movies here, are not as good as the originals. And anyone who's seen the Red Letter Media critiques of the prequel trilogy, as I have just had their view of it shattered completely. That was a huge disaster. I mean, it made money, but it's a huge disaster. When you compare the soundtracks, they're not as good, but it's not as dramatic a collapse. But one thing you'll notice, and I have all of them, I don't know why the case went to the Phantom Menace, but if you look at these are the original. This is the original Star Wars, and if you look, this is actually a book, and it's empty, but there are 2 CDs to it. And if you look at these, the original, this is the latest one, the Revenge of the Sith. Okay, there's a disc in there, but that's actually a DVD of music videos, which is actually kind of cool. But they're only 1 disc long, so they're half as long, even though the movies are actually the same length or longer. The other thing that's really weird about the prequel trilogy, as opposed to the original, in the originals, the soundtracks are in the order that the music plays in the movie. And so when I was talking about reliving a movie, the original Star Trek series is exactly like that. You put it in, you listen to it, and it's like you're watching the movie. You look at the Star Wars ones in like Episode 1, the second track is the most famous track. It's called Duel of the Fates. And it's the track that plays when Darth Maul is fighting Qui-Gon Jinn. So it's the climax of the movie at the very end, and that's track 2. That didn't make sense to me when I bought that CD back when I was in 9th grade. It still doesn't make sense to me. The track is cool. There's good music on the prequel trilogy stuff, but not as good, not as much, and the way it's outlined is not as good. So I don't recommend the prequel trilogy. The original trilogy, all 3 of them are good. The best one, and it's the same for the movies, at least to me, is definitely this guy, Empire Strikes Back, which is one of probably, it might be my favorite soundtrack. We basically have 3 soundtracks who are vying for that. It is an amazing soundtrack. The thematic material is amazing. It's like reliving the movie. When you hear when like Vader tells Luke that he's his father, you can hear that in the music, and that makes it actually difficult to assess the music on its own, because you're reliving the movie while you watch the music, and so it's like, is it the music or is it because of this great movie? You know, I don't think there's a way you can actually separate the 2, which is good though. That speaks well to the soundtrack. That's what it's supposed to do. So, Return of the Jedi is good, and the original Star Wars one I actually think is probably the second best of the 3, but they're all good. And the one problem though with these is that they have been so popular. These might be the most popular soundtracks ever written in terms of sales. They've come out numerous times, and if you go online, there are lots of different versions of them, and they're not all the same. And I would highly recommend, if you get these, that you go for these black books. They're books. They have these stupid fiberboard covers, and they're 2 discs. If you go online, it's very likely you'll find copies that are just 1 disc. Get the 2 disc versions. I wish I could tell you exactly. I mean, these have been out since I first got these probably in the late 90s. They were probably out before that, but you can find them on Amazon. Just they look like this. So an amazing group of soundtracks, maybe the most famous ever. There's so many themes in here that everyone recognizes, and that's, I mean, what composer wouldn't, isn't that the greatest thing you could ever wish for a composer? I hate, like, the guys at school, the composers there, they were actually snide about composers who wrote for money, and I'm like, you know what? Millions of people go around humming this stuff. No one will ever hum your stuff. So don't even pretend like what you do is as socially valuable as what they do. You make a living because the taxpayers give you money. Not the taxpayers, the government taxes people and gives you money. These people make money because people pay money to go watch their movies and buy their soundtracks. So that, to me, I couldn't tolerate that much of that. Now this, one of the 3 that vies for the top. It's by James Horner, and it is Braveheart. This is, I mean, when they're this good, they really shouldn't, be considered better or worse than each other. This is this amazing soundtrack. This is the first soundtrack I ever bought. This is the first movie that I really, really, really liked that I saw in the theaters. I think it was the first rated R movie that I saw too. And let's just give you this idea. I saw the preview for this movie in the VHS version of Forrest Gump that came out the year before this, and the preview was better than any movie I'd ever seen other than Star Wars up to that point. And the movie far exceeded what the preview let on. And the soundtrack is likewise incredible. Incredible. The action sequences are very innovative and unique. The offbeat stuff with the high strings, really cool. I've never heard anything like that before or since. But the beautiful melodious stuff in here is just wow. I didn't care for so much of it when I was a kid, but as an adult, I like it a lot more. And I liked it before, but I like it a lot more. It makes nice use of bagpipe. Bagpipe is really a shitty instrument in a lot of ways. It's cliche and it's good in certain settings, but really you don't want to listen to it very much. But it's used very well and tactfully here. And this is a very popular soundtrack, not like Star Wars, but very, very popular. And it's popular enough that they actually came out with more music from it. This is the aptly named More Music from Braveheart. This is good. If you're a big fan of the soundtrack, then it doesn't hurt to buy this. It has a lot of the dialogue. There's narration during the movie, and much of that narration is located in here. In terms of pure music, this is clearly the appendix to the original, which is much better, but they go good together. But this one, this one is a masterpiece. This is a masterpiece. I love this soundtrack, and as you see, I bought it twice. I mean, one copy I got, well, my parents bought it, but I remember the day. It was a long time ago, and I lost it. Actually, no, I think it got scratchy, and I still had it. And I was like, no, I need to have a real version of it, so I bought it again. And this version I use so much that I'll probably scratch that out, and I'll buy another one. So, now what? There's only one soundtrack to rule them all. And that would have to be The Lord of the Rings by Howard Shore. Howard Shore is the kind of composer, at least sometimes, who is the guy who says, I don't care what you think, this is the way I think it should be sounding. After he made Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson had him do King Kong, and Peter Jackson at one point was like, well, I don't like the way your King Kong is sounding. and he wouldn't change, and so he fired him and hired Gregson Wells to do his score in just a couple weeks. I'm not saying it's good or bad that he is that way, but what he achieved with Lord of the Rings is there's nothing like that in terms of its scope. Even the Star Wars movies are not as big a deal, and it's an extremely daunting task. And they're amazing soundtracks, all three of them. This is the Fellowship. This is the Two Towers. This is Return of the King. Now, I like these so much that I didn't just get those versions. I got the extended 4-disc each movie versions. So this is the Fellowship. It's 4 discs and then a DVD, which the DVD is just all the music on a DVD, so you can listen to it on a DVD player. And then like a little book about everything. These motherfuckers were like $80 each. They came out staggered over several years, and every year for Christmas I asked for a new one, and every year for Christmas I got a new one. But I would have bought them if I had money. Anyway, they are incredible. He has to write for all these different cultures: the dwarves, the elves, men, the Nazgul, Sauron, the hobbits, the wizards, and he does it. And with someone like the elves, they're supposedly angelic, perfect beings who have culture that's more sophisticated than humans can understand. And Howard Shore has to write music for them and music by them, because there are parts where they play music. And the stuff that he does, it plausibly sounds that way, which is amazing. But he makes great use of leitmotifs here. Leitmotifs is when you have a certain theme that's associated with a place, a person, a character. Extensively used in these movies, and they're used in other places. Darth Vader has a theme, Luke Skywalker has a theme. It's a pretty common thing. Wagner basically pioneered, although I highly doubt invented that idea. It comes to an amazing degree of fruition in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. These are epic soundtracks. They're very beautiful to listen to when they do nice stuff, when there's battles and fighting and tension. They're exhilarating in a way very few other pieces of music ever are or can be. It captures the depth and the scope of Tolkien's vision, which is the most expansive vision that I've ever read in fiction anywhere. I mean, you can have, say, oh, well, it's going to be the whole universe like Star Wars, but is it, how much substance is there? It's one thing to just set your goalposts really far apart. It's another thing to fill it up with grass. Okay, terrible analogy, but these are epic soundtracks. If I had to pick, I would say the Fellowship of the Ring is on net. The first one is the best of the three, and that Return of the King is the next, and the Two Towers is the weakest. But the Two Towers is amazing. Just listen to the first track of the Two Towers. Is when the recap where it shows Gandalf fighting the Balrog. Amazing stuff. Amazing, thrilling stuff. Howard Shore, and I actually had a Howard Shore score before Lord of the Rings came out. He did the score to The Fly, and there's a scene in that where the 1986 remake of The Fly with Jeff Goldblum. There's a scene in that where Jeff Goldblum basically goes, he basically has his girlfriend blow his brains out, commit suicide, and the music that goes on during that captures such pathos that even as a little kid, it really struck me. And it was interesting because then I found out Peter Jackson, who's actually a horror film fan, he liked that score too, and that's the reason he asked Howard Shore to do this. And which I thought was interesting. Now, that score, you can hear it. The creepy stuff in Lord of the Rings, like the music around Shelob, it really does sound like the music from The Fly. But if you just listen to The Fly, you would never have guessed that this could have come out of that. This is incredible. It's been redone. There's lots of symphonic works that are based on it. There's, the local symphony where I'm from, or the nearest one to where I'm from, actually would play the movie and then have an orchestra actually playing the soundtrack with it. It's that good. So um, these are excellent soundtracks, and I highly recommend, if you like them, I would highly recommend getting the extended soundtracks. It comes out to be about 12 discs, so it takes like I think 11 or 12 hours to listen to, maybe 13 hours. When I worked in West Virginia, even driving all the way there to all the way home, it wasn't enough time to listen to all three of them. When I drove out to Utah, I was able to do it a few times. And it's chronological, so you listen to it and it's like going through the movie. You have the prologue, you have all the stuff in the middle, you have the end, and um, they're just wonderful soundtracks. And I'm so confident in his skills that I have already purchased the Hobbit soundtrack, even though I haven't heard it or seen the movie. I highly doubt the movies will be as good as Lord of the Rings, but I have enough confidence in Howard Shore that I went ahead and pre-ordered them. So that will be it on the ones that I've done. I was going to try and put little segments of little bits of the music, but that would have taken forever. The music video is already 46 minutes long. I'm not going to put links. Most of these you can find, at least parts of them, online. If anyone has any questions about tracks or whatever, I'd happy to answer or refer you to where you can get them, although this being the internet age, that would probably not be necessary in most circumstances. But these guys write for pay, and the stuff that they produce has value. I value it, and I'm willing to pay money. When I make an exchange, if I pay $10 for a CD, that means at least I was willing to pay $10. If the CD was $15, I might have paid for it. You don't know. The guys who get state subsidy have no such discipline, and the stuff they write is never going to achieve that level of value. Even if they have it in within them to maybe possibly do that, they have no incentive to. He gets a nice job. He doesn't have to work his ass off. I'm thinking of a particular person here, but this could be any of the many state-sponsored composers that exist out there. Market discipline creates high art. Doesn't degrade it or destroy it as the Venus Project idiots would have us believe. So, alright, that's it for now. Anyone who managed to watch this entire thing, let me know. That would be interesting to me. If you have any soundtracks that you also think are great, and I have other ones, but I just didn't mention them. By all means, drop me a line, send me a link to a great track that you think out there. I'm always looking for good music, and that's it.